Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. This week, we'll take a look at the recent Ukrainian offensive in the Kursk region of Russia, and we'll talk about the conditions for successful negotiations. For this, I will be joined by George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War. But before we do that, let's take a look at the latest stories coming straight out of Ukraine.
January 9th marked yet another meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group in Ramstein, with the US making a significant gesture of support to Kyiv as the Biden administration prepares to hand over power to President-elect Donald Trump.
I am announcing today another presidential drawdown authority package valued at $500 million. It includes additional missiles for Ukrainian air defense, more ammunition, more air-to-ground munitions, and other equipment to support Ukraine's F-16s.
The meeting was also a chance for Volodymyr Zelensky to discuss strengthening Ukraine's air defense capabilities and obtaining Western funding for the country's arms production.
We need air defense systems you gave us already, thank you so much, and we need very much systems you promised us.
The meeting is the last in its current format before Donald Trump takes office on January 20th. The president-elect has frequently criticized the Biden administration's assistance to Ukraine, raising concerns about the continuation of U.S. support.
Will there be the will and willingness to continue supporting Kyiv on the part of the new U.S. administration? We are preparing for this leading role of the United States to continue. Without them, it will be very difficult in this format to get this capacity.
Change in the White House casts a shadow over the Ramstein-formed Ukraine Defense Contact Group, a coalition of 57 nations which has been coordinating military aid for Ukraine since April 2022. Since its formation, it has pledged over $120 billion in aid to Kyiv.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Scenes like this are a daily occurrence for many in Ukraine, but there is no getting used to Russian attacks. In the early morning of January 8th, citizens of Zaporizhia became a target.
Russia aimed for a residential district with 2 guided aerial bombs. As of now, we know of 13 dead and 113 wounded people.
The attack has left the community in shock, with survivors recounting scenes of chaos and destruction. This is Volodymyr. He was picking up workers from the local factory when the attack came, killing 2 passengers on the spot.
People were leaving from their shift through the main entrance of the enterprise, and that's when the attack came. There were 2 very loud explosions.
Zaporizhia, located near the front lines of the ongoing conflict, has faced repeated shelling since the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022. Volodymyr Zelensky decried the attack, labeling it an act of terror and urging international allies to intensify pressure on Russia.
We must force Russia to peace. We must continue doing everything necessary to protect lives and stop deaths. It is crucial to maintain the unity of all our partners, America, Europe, and all partners worldwide who are helping.
The latest strike underscores the ongoing human toll of the war, with civilians once again caught in the crossfire. The attack in Zaporizhia, however, was one of hundreds which occurred throughout the week across the country. In a historic feat for the F-16 Fighting Falcon, a Ukrainian pilot intercepted and destroyed 6 Russian cruise missiles during a single combat mission. While it occurred back in December, the Ukrainian Air Force Command announced it this week. The mission took place amidst a massive Russian aerial strike involving nearly 200 drones and almost 100 missiles. The pilot, whose identity remains undisclosed, downed 4 missiles using medium and short-range air-to-air missiles before running low on fuel and ammunition. Despite this, he successfully destroyed 2 additional missiles with his aircraft cannon, marking the first successful real-world use of cannons against such targets in combat. Ukraine has deployed US-made F-16s supplied by the Netherlands and Denmark as part of its defense against Russia's mass strikes on cities and infrastructure. A French army official has confirmed that several dozen Ukrainian soldiers from the 155th Anov Kyiv Mechanized Brigade deserted while undergoing military training in France. The unit has faced increasing scrutiny following reports of widespread desertion and mismanagement. Ukrainian publication Censor.net claimed that over 1,700 soldiers went AWOL between March and November 2024, with around 50 deserting during their training in France. Editor Yuri Butusov attributed the issues to poor command and insufficient vetting of new recruits. The brigade, named after a Ukrainian princess who married French King Henry I in 1051 in the nearby Cathedral of Reims, was trained in France between September and December last year before leaving for Ukraine. At the time, its commander was positive about the brigade's future.
French instructors have prepared this training to the highest level. The level of French soldiers is very high, and I think that after this training, my soldiers will be trained at a high level in order to go to combat and will be very efficient on the battlefield.
The brigade, comprising around 5,800 troops, is part of a flagship program where Kyiv's allies train new Ukrainian military units and provide heavy equipment. Fewer than 2,000 members of the brigade have received training in France. Ukrainian officials acknowledge problems with staffing, training and command within the brigade. In response, Ukraine's State Bureau of Investigation launched a probe into suspected desertion and abuse of authority. Outgoing U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken stated on January 6 that Ukraine's cross-border operations in Russia's Kursk region could play an important role in potential peace negotiations.
I think it's going to be very, very important that if this gets to a point where there is negotiation and where there is eventually a ceasefire, it be done on the best possible terms and consistent with something that is both just and durable.
These comments follow reports of Ukrainian counterattacks in Kursk region, where a cross-border incursion launched in August 2024 seized 1,300 square kilometers of Russian territory.
In the Kursk region, we are steadily inflicting losses on the Russian Federation.
Moscow has since recaptured about half of the lost ground, bolstered by reinforcements including thousands of North Korean troops. The remarks from Blinken come amid growing speculation about peace talks in 2025, following the election of U.S. President-elect Donald Trump.
And now joining me to discuss Ukraine's current situation on the battlefield and how to bolster Kyiv to a position of strength before any potential negotiations is the Russia team and geospatial intelligence team lead on the Russia and Ukraine portfolio at the Institute for the Study of War, George Barros. Hello, George, and thank you very much for joining us this week on Ukraine This Week.
Hey, Don. Good afternoon. Good evening. It's nice to see you again. Hope you had a great new year.
Yes, you too. You too. Now, since the new year, there's been a renewed Ukrainian offensive in the Kursk region of Russia. And so I'd like to get your assessment on what has been achieved in this latest move by Ukraine.
Absolutely. So not to be a wet blanket, but the scale of the attack is quite small. I'm not sure if it's necessarily an offensive operation, that is a campaign, but what we saw on Sunday, on January 5, is Ukrainian forces resumed offensive attacks for the first time in several months. Ukrainian forces managed to expand their control lines slightly into a Russian town called Berdyn. But within 72 hours, Russian forces had counterattacked, repelled the Ukrainian forces, and moved them back. The size and scale of this attack was actually quite small. We're assessing its echelon to be about a battalion, so that is maybe less than 1,000 Ukrainians participated in it, 3 to 4 companies. The battle lines haven't changed substantially. Russian forces might have even regained a little bit of territory, but Russians are saying that this was not the end of whatever this was. It's quite possible this was a practice run for a larger operation, or potentially a distraction, a diversion for a larger intended and planned Ukrainian offensive, which could occur elsewhere in Kursk or elsewhere in the theater within occupied Ukraine. So not a lot's really changed. It was a relatively small attack, got a lot of media fanfare, but no major changes to report this time.
Right. Now, if we look at other places along the front line, of course, the trend continues, and especially around the area of Pokrovsk, we see huge progress being made to the south of Pokrovsk. How is that influencing what is still yet ahead before we have the inauguration of Donald Trump? And of course, the efforts to shore up these Russian gains as quick as possible.
Yeah, so the Russian forces throughout quarter four of 2024, were making accelerated gains throughout the entirety of the theater, including in Kursk, including near Pokrovsk. But it started to slow down actually in December. The rate of Russian advance started to slow down. They're showing signs of exhaustion. The Russian casualty rates and the burn rate of vehicles and men in that sector of the front has been catastrophic. I mean, we're talking over 1,000 armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, over 500 tanks lost over the course of the year in that direction alone, over 5 mechanized divisions worth of losses. And the Russians suffer about 100 casualties for every square kilometer they take, which is a extremely heavy price to pay. I think that the Russian command made a decision that they're going to sprint at the end of this marathon because the Russian command seeks to put forward this image that Russian battlefield victories are inevitable, that Russian gains are inevitable, and therefore we should enter these negotiations and make pre-concessions that Moscow wants to extract from Ukraine, when really I would argue that actually there's a tremendous amount of leverage that we have on the Russians. The Russians are putting forward the image of the Potemkin economy and the Potemkin military, that Russia actually has several vulnerabilities that we can exploit, and it should be Moscow, not Ukraine and not the West, that should make concessions if we are to have any kind of negotiations.
Right. Now, another thing I'd like to pick your brain on is what is your impression about the North Koreans that have been sent to the front over there in Kursk? We've heard of significant losses already of the 10,000-ish soldiers that are presumed to have been sent to that part of the theater. Based on your expectations when this news broke out and where we are today, how would you assess the performance of these soldiers?
That's a very great question. In terms of the effectiveness, it's low. What we see in tactically are platoon, maybe company-sized elements, that is, maybe 50 to 40, maybe up to 100 North Koreans being sent in these frontal dismounted infantry assaults. They do not receive vehicle support, and they're being used in a very bovine sort of way to march across empty fields, and the Ukrainians are killing them in droves and at scale. That said, they still do make gains. They impose requirements on the Ukrainians for defense. They managed to take territory back. The Russians net have taken back at least 48% of what the Ukrainians initially had. And while the attrition rates are terrible, those infantry do get used in the manner that the Russians like to use infantry at scale in order to advance. So it's not that what we would call in the West effective, because it's just not an effective tactic, but it is effective in that it plugs and plays into the larger Russian concept of operations, which is based on using mass and scale for small advances. It's a tremendous waste of human life, though. And these are not your ordinary North Korean soldiers. These come from the North Korean 11th Army Corps, which is North Korean Special Forces and Airborne Infantry. And if this is the best that the North Korean military has to offer, then they're being wasted in a really inefficient sort of bovine way.
Yeah, it reminds me back when I was near Bakhmut in the final days before that city fell, the Ukrainian soldiers were telling me they were sick and tired of killing so many Russians, and it was actually quite exhausting for them. So I imagine there's some similar comparison there. But now let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about how to get Ukraine in a position of strength that we've heard so much about, both on the political front, but also, I mean, if we look at the current situation, Ukraine does need to be in a position of strength to be able to even contemplate and let alone sit down for negotiations. So what do you think this actually means in terms of something that we can see overall?
Absolutely. So 3 big points here. Look, any sort of negotiation that we're going to have that presupposes preconcessions on Ukraine's sovereignty is a non-starter. For example, Russian President Vladimir Putin to this very day continues to demand that Ukraine should not have the ability to join NATO or the European Union. And I'm sorry, but any sort of negotiation that starts at that premise must be a non-starter. Because Ukraine is a fully sovereign state. It has the right to association. It has the right to have relations with unions and treaty organizations and other countries as it so seeks. And if we accept the same premise that France and Germany accepted with the Minsk Accords back in 2014, that Ukraine actually is not a fully sovereign state, then that is just the path to a larger war in the future. So that's the first condition. Second condition is that Ukraine must have geographically defensible borders, a geographically defensible front line. We can talk in depth about what that geographically requires, but suffice it to say, the current front line, especially the southern front line near the Dnieper River at Kherson and Zaporizhia, is not defensible. That gets to the third point, which Ukraine must conduct some operationally significant counteroffensives over time in the future to liberate territory to, number one, get to those geographically defensible borders, and number two, Putin must feel that the situation can get worse for him. Putin is not going to have any incentive to actually make concessions and come to a stable peace that can be the new stable equilibrium unless there is actually some risk and liability there. And that requires the Ukrainians to attack. And I'd also argue that, and we can get into this in a larger discussion, but actually the West has a tremendous amount of leverage over Russia right now. And we should think about our negotiation strategy of how to use that as opposed to essentially giving the Kremlin Putin's desired deal and blowing it all before we even been able to exploit it.
Well, let's go into that. In terms of leverage that the West currently has over Russia, what are the main points that the West does have and the West does need to utilize?
So Putin did not plan to wage a protracted war of 3 years. This was supposed to be the short, several day special military operation. And look, the Kremlin has successfully, over the course of the last 3 years, micromanaged the margins of its economy, of its domestic situation, of Russia's defense industrial base to maintain operations in Ukraine. But that system is, the tank is running low. Three components to this. It's sort of like this wobbly three-legged stool that the Kremlin's sitting on. Russian defense industrial base. We can see how the Russians have been continuing to get masses of tanks and armored personnel carriers into Ukraine is not because Russia is producing these tanks at scale. Russia only produces about 20 to 30 new tanks for serial production per month. Russia's been actually pulling its Soviet store of its inheritance of that large mass of vehicles that the Red Army used. And it's a finite resource and it's running out. We can look at the satellite imagery, all of the scrapyards and boneyards and long-term storage depots from which they're being pulled. And all of the quality analysis of those sites indicates that the Russians are going to run critically low on these vehicles by the end of 2025, provided the current tempo and the current burn rate that we're seeing. The second leg to this wobbly stool has to do with Russia's demographic situation. The Russians lose on average between 30 to 45,000 casualties killed and wounded per month. The Russians have successfully generated volunteers to go fight in Ukraine, roughly the same amount just to offset it up until this point, but their system for generating forces is starting to become delinquent. The regional governors who are responsible for meeting monthly quotas, they're actually now starting to openly petition the Russian Ministry of Defense to lower the quota because they can't meet it. The Russians continue to put forward these absurd financial incentives, the new record now being set by Samara Oblast, 4 million rubles, about $36,000, just for a one-time signing bonus. And these systems are increasingly failing to actually meet the number of people that they're going to need. So, of course, Putin will have to call a new mobilization. It's a question of when, not whether, but that's not going to solve all of his problems, because it leads us to the third problem, which is Russia's economic issues. Look, Russians can either serve in uniform in Ukraine, or they can work in the domestic economy and contribute to Russian wealth, but they can't do both. And those 30,000 Russians that are killed or wounded each month do neither. And in fact, they suck up state resources. Russia has a labor deficit of 1 million people. The Russian ruble, because everyone's been receiving all of this cash from the Ministry of Defense for these incentives to work in Ukraine, it's caused tremendous inflation. The official inflation rates of between 8 and 9%. The actual and realistic inflation rate is closer to 25%. The ruble's trading against the US dollar for 1 penny. There's widespread shortages of eggs in Russia. Butter's up by 25%. And Russia's sovereign wealth fund, which is how Putin's been financing the war up to this point, the liquidity of the sovereign wealth fund is down from what it was before the war in 2022, from about $120 billion. It's now closer to $56 billion. And with the Russian current budget deficit, they're going to be taking out a significant chunk of that. And so, look, as the time progresses and as the Russians continue to lose their tanks, they continue to run out of more militarily able-bodied men who can also serve and work in the economy. And as the Russians continue to burn through their sovereign wealth fund, really, the Russian situation becomes more precarious, assuming we can keep the Ukrainians in the fight. And so my argumentation for the negotiation strategy would be, look, Putin wants a quick deal. He wants his deal very quickly so that he can evade having to make difficult decisions about the trade-offs between the economy, force generation, running out of tanks in about a year. And so he'd really like to off-ramp to evade those issues. The West, on the other hand, should actually go to Putin with strength and say, actually, we're going to keep fighting, we're going to keep supporting the Ukrainians so that they can continue bleeding you. And if we cannot come to a reasonable negotiation where actually Russia makes concessions, then that's fine, Putin. We're not going to, there's no deal to be had. Your demands are a non-starter, and we'll return to negotiations in 6 months after how many more tens of thousands of Russians are killed, and the inflation situation is that much worse, and national wealth is that much poorer. And this is how you actually drive a hard deal to extract concessions from a Russia, which is in no place to be demanding concessions of the West.
So 2025, do you believe, is going to be actually a crucial, pivotal year for Ukraine if the West can continue to keep up the pressure on Russia? Are there cracks that could suddenly appear which could make it too late to reverse? I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to say. I've long thought that Russia would continue to go much further than it can technically go, based on economy and weapons, as you've mentioned. And once the cracks show, it's going to be already too late. Is that a possible scenario for Russia in 2025?
2025 is going to be a decisive and pivotal year. Look, a lot of eyes are looking to Washington. Will the United States continue to decisively support Ukraine and their fight for freedom? If not, will the Europeans be able to take forward the banner, right? So the questions, I don't have the answer to these questions, but Putin is doing his hardest to shape that debate and shape our perceptions of what's at stake here. For that reason, yes, 2025 will be decisive. Now, I hope that if we do renew our commitments and continue supporting the Ukrainians, as is within Washington's selfish geopolitical, realpolitik interest, then there is a chance that the closer we will drive the Russians to a breaking point. Kind of similarly to how the West drove the Soviet Union to a breaking point in the late 80s with the Cold War. I mean, it's an imperfect analogy, but all of the, when we did the postmortem of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, and we studied sort of all of the indicators for the health of the vital organs of the Soviet Union, vis-a-vis its production, its economy, the status of the people, how militarily overstretched the Soviet Union was at the time, it sort of became a no-brainer that the Soviet Union collapsed as dramatically as it did. But at the time, up until that point, we actually were extremely scared of the Soviet Union. We thought that Russia was very strong. It was the height of the Cold War. Defense spending was crazy. But when it collapsed, it happens quickly. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen to Russia. And I'm not predicting a modern crash of Russia. But a lot of these factors rhyme. And a lot of the indicators for the Russian economy's internal organ vital health is poor. And now's the time to actually push on it, because if we don't push on it and we let the Russians win in part or in whole, it will only embolden Putin to take what he has in Ukraine, go further, and expand his empire beyond Ukraine, because we explicitly, in his own terms, he defines Russia's historical lands as going well beyond Ukraine.
Well, we're just days away from what could be a very different and new approach to the war in Ukraine, at least from the U.S. perspective. So I guess we have a lot to look forward to this year. George Barros, Russia team lead at the Institute for the Study of War, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate your analysis, and you always have an open invitation to come back.
Thank you so much, Don. Great to see you as always, and hope you have a great start of your year. We'll have an interesting one coming up.
All right, you too. Thank you. And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for all the latest from the war in Ukraine. Thank you for watching, and see you then. Goodbye.